Hey guys, it's Mr. Schmidt here, and in this video we're going to turn to the second of three key macroeconomic indicators and start talking about unemployment. So remember, there are three key indicators that basically tell us how healthy our macroeconomy is. We've already talked about one of them, GDP, and now we're going to talk about another one called unemployment. So unemployment, as we're going to define it in this course, is people who are actively looking for a job but aren't working. And so there's two key parts to that definition. First of all, they can't be working, which I think those of you who are familiar with the idea of unemployment would probably recognize that's got to be true. And the other key part here is they have to be actively looking. So if you're someone who doesn't have a job, but either doesn't want one, isn't looking, or has given up looking, you're actually not considered unemployed. And we'll talk about where we would put you in terms of a category in just a second. But unemployment is people who aren't working but are actively looking for a job. Now, in order to get the unemployment rate, which is the percent of the labor force that is unemployed, and we'll define labor force in just a second, to get that, we take our number of unemployed people, okay, so it could be, 50 people, divided by our labor force, so we could say maybe the labor force is 100 people, and then we multiply that result times 100. And so if we did that using the numbers I gave here, we would have an unemployment rate of about 50, of exactly, not about, exactly 50%. And that would be insanely high. Like that would be Great Depression to the extreme high, right? A good unemployment rate is somewhere around 4 to 6%. We'll talk about this in the next video. So you can see that 50% would be really, 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 really high. Okay, and we'll also talk in the next video about why you wouldn't want 0% unemployment either, so just keep that in mind. Now, we did, of course, mention in this formula this idea of the labor force. The labor force is simply all the employed people plus all the unemployed people. So either the people who have a job or those that don't, or plus those that don't, but are actively looking. So the working plus those who want work but don't have any. That is the labor force. And we can also calculate something called the labor force participation rate. I'm actually going to skip over a slide just a second here. The labor force participation rate is the percent of the adult population that is in the labor force. And so the way you get that is you take your labor force, so you would need to know how many people are employed plus how many people are unemployed, and then you're going to add that number, or add those two numbers together to get the labor force, divide by how many adults there are in the population, and then we multiply that result times 100, and then you would get some percent, and that would tell you what fraction of your adult population is in the labor force. So now let's drill down a little bit into who is considered in the labor force. So first of all, you got to be at least 16 to be in the labor force. So we don't count babies, we don't count young people in the labor force. You have to be able and willing to work. So you have to want to work. That's the actively looking piece, or you're actually working. And you have to be physically able and mentally able as well. So we see the third bullet. You can't be in jail or institutionalized because that would prevent you from working. You can't be in the military because that would mean you already have a job. And we kind of classify military jobs a little bit differently than anybody else. School, they actually have their own unemployment rate. School full-time, you can't be in school full-time because that would mean you're not actively looking for a job and you probably don't have a job. And you can't be retired for the exact same reason. You probably don't have a job and aren't looking for one because you are retired. So just keep that in mind when we think about who's in the labor force. Finally, I want to talk about two key criticisms of how we calculate the unemployment rate in the United States and really throughout the world. The first one here is discouraged workers. some people give up looking for work and are not counted as unemployed, right? So if you see someone on this, the side of a busy road, holding up a sign asking for money, you and I would both think of that person as unemployed. But if we talk to them and they say, hey, I'm actually not looking for a job right now, or I can't find one, discouraged worker, then you would not count that person as in the labor force as unemployed, even though you and I would both logically, common sense, say that that person is unemployed. So discouraged workers, this concept, we tend to understate the unemployment rate. It could actually be much greater than what's reported because it doesn't include discouraged workers. The other problem is something called underemployed workers. So there are some people who have a job but want to work more hours, or they want a better job, and that's not really reflected in the unemployment rate. We just call them employed. It doesn't matter if you're working 5 hours or 100 hours a week, you're still considered employed. And so we don't really have a way to talk about people who want to work more hours, or at least measure that, but aren't actually working that number of hours. So discouraged workers, underemployed workers are two key criticisms of the unemployment rate. So one of the last things I do want to mention in this video before we go is this relationship between GDP and the unemployment rate. I just want to mention it very quickly before we go. So remember, GDP is output, right? And so let's think about this. If more stuff is being produced, let's say GDP is increasing, if more stuff is being made, you probably need more people, more workers, the firms do, to make the stuff, right? More stuff's being made, you need more people to make the stuff. And so if GDP is increasing, unemployment tends to decrease because more people are getting hired to make this extra output, this increased output. So just keep in mind and remember that GDP and unemployment have an inverse relationship, okay? When output goes up, unemployment tends to go down. When unemployment is going up, output tends to be going down. So just keep that relationship in mind because it'll come in handy later on. That's all for this video on defining and calculating unemployment. Until next time, have a great day.